is somewhat all right. So the topic that I want to cover is somewhat me uh, playing out a concept that I have in my head of a conversation that I wish were happening a lot more, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if this conversation ever happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so, kind of like the core concept is I, for the past few years, have been describing myself as a right-wing progressive.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to try and carry a conversation as sort of a right-wing progressive with you who are sort of more standard on the right wing, from my understanding.
Okay.
And so I guess I would start with you describing yourself a bit in terms of life experience and like sort of general political views. You don't have to go into too much detail, but sort of giving like a concept of who I'm talking to in the political sense, and then we'll sort of find a conversation from there that flows naturally and
Mm-hmm.
kind of see where it goes and have a bit of fun with it. But I want to trial the concept a little bit more intentionally, trying to create a conversation that I want to happen versus replicating most of the conversations that end up happening between left and right by modeling right wing progressive, where I sort of tribalize on the right, but I share a lot of concept space, values, and vision
Mm-hmm.
with the left in terms of the left that I actually like, which is
Mm-hmm.
somewhere in between the people who have left the left and like exited the left, like walk like hashtag walk away from a few years ago. I
Mm-hmm.
mirror a lot with those people, but I also mirror a lot with the people in parts of social justice. And so, like most of the Democratic Party, I have nothing in common with, just with I have very little in common with the Republican Party. But there's
Mm-hmm.
lots of people on the right that I have a lot of common with. But I also have a lot of common with people who've left the left and people who are perhaps the most deep into the left
Mm-hmm.
in some sense. And so it's kind of a weird position, but I'm trying to distill it into the concept of right wing progressive, because I think
Okay.
that's where the concept space actually makes the most sense,
Mm-hmm.
and actually creates the healthiest discussion.
Okay.
But I haven't had this discussion a lot with people on the right. I've
Mm-hmm.
basically just had it like mostly with my one best friend, who's like a security guard and is something of a gun nut. And so it's like I haven't trialed this conversation space a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a bit like I've tried it out in like different circles on the left, and generally it goes pretty well, but I haven't tried it out on the right so much.
Mm-hmm.
But if you would describe yourself a bit and give me a position that I'm talking to or a person that I'm talking to in terms of politics, and instead of like the friend that I know from the internet, then
Right.
we can get
Right.
it rolling.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. So I'm Cody. For those that don't know me,
Hey, Cody.
I have um very strange experiences in my life as far as um I think what most people have. I mean, I've definitely been interviewed before, so this is not new. I think we should get that out of the way. Um, I am quite good at speaking to people in general. I've given speeches, motivational usually. As in terms of political, I'm a bit of an ideological wildcat. So I mean, I was raised in a very right wing conservative household. Wanted to join the military, super still into the military, but I became disillusioned like halfway through college because I got rejected from the one place that I wanted to be, which was in the United States military in some facet, um, and kind of flirted with anarchism for a little bit, and basically realized because of the problems that I had trying to create accessibility for myself because I have a disability and I cannot drive, and dealing with employment prospects and everything else. Um, I would describe myself as a capitalist, which is neither left nor right. I almost feel as though I'm an authoritarian, but in the sense that if you make a rule, you better damn well follow it because that's why it's there. If you're gonna not have rules, then you might as well just have anarchism, which makes no sense on its head anyway. Um, so the experience of having my own business has made me kind of shift and fully embrace capitalism, but I would describe myself as um, I mean an ideological wildcat in the sense that I'm socially conservative, fiscally. um I don't know where you would put me because things that I think that need to be done, I'm gonna spend the money on. You know, I would consider myself to be kind of right wing with a green thumb, and I use the term right wing very loosely, um, because I think that there's things on the left that I agree with, things in the middle that I agree with, and a few things on the right that I agree with. Um, the one thing that I can tell you, uh, that is 100% true as far as I'm concerned is that I have a very strict interpretation of the Constitution, although I think that it should be um, viewed in a more technocratic kind of spotlight. I think it needs to be modernized a wee bit, but I don't know how to go into the modernization of it. I would consider myself a strict constitutionalist because I believe in the fundamentals of capitalism, and I feel that capitalism in itself, especially um, since the hey high days of World War II, recently, I would say probably since the 70s, have been kind of turned on their head. And so, what I mean by that is, I feel like oligopolies have swallowed up a lot of the wealth that was created in this country. And I feel the internet has re equalized some of the ground that people sit on. But the argument that I have with Marxists a lot, which I'll talk to anybody, I don't care. I think that's one of the things that I quite enjoy, is that they say that they don't want to read the tax code, and I said, well, the tax code is written for everybody. And the point that I always bring up to them, because they always want to have an equal society, and they want to have a business where the employees uh, make decisions in the business as a group collectively, and I told them that in the tax code there is a business system set up for up to 50 employees to exist upon um, that exact statement or thought process. The tax code isn't written for anything above that, but if it became popular enough and collective enough, I mean, it would. That there's no reason why the tax code couldn't be amended, and I don't think it has to come from like this left leaning kind of Marxist ideology. Um, the other thing that I want to mention before I let you jump into what you want to mention that I think is lost on a lot of people, um, and it's been because it's been mentioned to me by um, several, I guess you could call them capitalist influencers, or um, and I'm using the term influencers just to help our younger viewers kind of understand where I'm kind of going with this. I'm not talking in terms of, oh, these people have YouTube channels. Corporations historically, when they've been set up systemically, have elements of Marxism in them inherently, because there's one guy at the top that controls everything, and the board of directors has to have people below him that follow his moves and everything has to be done for the good of the company, which you could say is inference of the state. Um, so there is a collective ideology inside every corporation in America, whether people want to admit to it or not. The problem that I think people run into is that they say the purest Marxism form of like absolute communism has never been tried because there's always been a dictator that's absorbed power. And so I've been kind of toying with that because I was raised to hate communism, and I'm not saying I'm a communist. I'm just saying that you can't say that there isn't this commune capitalist thing going on because there's the middle class wealth that has been generated in this country has been slowly swallowed up by individuals that have had the means to raise the capital to get their businesses off the ground. And because globalization has taken place, you've had, instead of these mom and pop shops that you had back like 30 or 40 years ago, you have what you have now, where that's been replaced by the internet. So I think it's an interesting dichotomy. And those are the things that I kind of talk about with myself on a day-to-day basis because I can't find anybody else to say it with. So I'm just interesting how I'm giving you a lot of points. If you want to jump off on any of them, go ahead. But I feel like I've said everything that I want to say.
All right, all right. I guess the first thing is I want to spot you on one topic because I want to run an experiment on this topic.
Okay.
Is I remember you saying that you were pro-life.
Yeah.
Right. So I want to kind of go into that because that's sort of the classic, one of the classic right-wing positions that I think is not like almost never discussed in a sane way. And we always end up with like the most insane discussion on it. It's a meme that neither side of the like pro-life women's choice debate is like likable by the majority of the population.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to try and
That's
model
interesting.
this is the meme. I say nothing about the meme being true. I just say that it is the meme.
Uh-huh.
But sort of this is one of the classic points of conversation where it's like we as a nation need to settle somewhere on
Mm-hmm.
this topic because if
I
we
couldn't agree more.
like if we keep getting more and more extreme, we're going to have some states where children aren't children until they go through some kind of ceremonial event after birth, and
Mm-hmm.
other states where like there's a death penalty for abortions, and like that's what we're going to end up with. And
I'm sure one could make
not
that
not
argument.
not
Yeah.
perhaps literally, but
Right. Right.
metaphorically, like that the extremes that we are going to in this argument are absurd.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like we need to settle somewhere that is sane.
Mm-hmm.
And in some sense, uh, nobody has a good argument in this
Mm-hmm.
conversation. And in
Mm-hmm.
some sense, both sides actually have incredibly salient arguments that are deeply important, but are on what is, I think, important to understand, which is rarely understood, is that the arguments that we're having, like the good salient arguments, are on two different dimensions of the conversation. We're not actually talking about the same things when we're having a talk about pro-life, women's choice, abortion. And so I want to pitch you a completely new take
Okay.
on
This is interesting.
the abortion topic, which is sort of my right wing progressive position, or really because what I really want is for right wing progressive to become a term that people can use for their own sort of wildcat positions,
Mm-hmm.
um, instead of being like a term that I own.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I will give you another term for this, which is the term that I own more personally, which is this is my cultural philosophy position on the topic of abortion.
Okay.
And it's the idea is to think through stuff through the entirety of the layers, with the kind of core concept that we should try and aim for intuitive sense making, and that we should also aim for the version of things that you encounter and interact with as default should make sense if you think about them very deeply. Instead of sort of if you go into a part of reality and you interact with it for a longer and longer time, it becomes more and more dystopian and perverse and disgruntling. It should be that it makes sense on like a first encounter level, and then also makes sense on, or sort of the learning curve takes you to a better place instead of the learning curve trapping you in a false reality and you having to go very, very deep in order to recognize the true reality, right? I think that conception makes sense. So the cultural philosophy position, I'll give you like the one sentence version of this first, is abortion makes a lot of sense as something that we as a society should allow. Sort of, the right way to do it is sort of most abortions happening around the end of the first trimester. People know that they're pregnant. They have a period of time to think about it and make the decision. Whether like having a child in their life would be terrible for the child and for them, or something that they want, and that's a decision people can make. But that having like the ability to have an abortion during late term is also important for medical reasons, and not getting like very hung up on having a bunch of rules in place for that means that people can make good decisions about medical health, like if abortion is necessary to save the life of the mother, or it's very medically risky to go complete the pregnancy. That's like a tragic situation to be in, and people need as like little social and legal pressure controlling them when they're making those decisions, because those decisions are very often life and death, and having like just the decision itself and not all this weight around it is also important. And then on the other end of this conversation is that the necessity for us as a society to hold children and what specifically children represent to us psychologically and even spiritually, I think it's important, to bring that language to this, as the future, is holding that as sacred in our minds and like deeply important in our minds is absolutely vital to having a sane culture and having a sane society that doesn't destroy itself. And that's fundamentally what I think the right is trying to protect with being pro-life, is the sacredness of the future, the sacredness of children, the sacredness of the next generation, and what the next generation represents as the future of humanity, as us going into the future, as the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, all the future lives of potential that our decisions will affect as we go forward through life. Holding that, like that concept, that space in our mind as deeply sacred, is vitally important to society and culture. And those two things are entirely reconcilable. Like the what is sacred to the right and what is necessary from a like medical perspective, for like women being able to make good decisions for themselves and their children without a lot of social pressure, for like medical health. But also, you don't want to be bringing children into the world whose lives are going to be terrible. And adoption and foster families are often not great choices. Like if you had the ability, like, to decide between coming into life, knowing what would happen throughout your life, and you had the decision before, like you had to care about yourself as an individual in the sense of your ego, and you could choose whether or not to come into life as someone who would go through foster care, likely be sexually abused, go into a foster family where you're the different child who never really feels at place and at home, into a life where you never really get that second chance, um, and sort of everything is always falling apart around you, and you never really feel at home, you never really feel like you belong, you never really feel like your life is yours. And you could make the decision not being like, I need to live because I am me, but from an abstract pre-life position. um, Foster care and adoption really aren't something that you would want to choose upon yourself. And so, with that in mind, as like all of that, making good decisions, like of how we bring life into the world, is the position that both the left and the right share here. Making the right decision on a deep level of how we bring life into the world is what we're talking about. And we both, on the left and the right, have, I think, a lot of depth to the position that doesn't necessarily get brought in, because we are sort of fighting about it instead of trying to find the right cultural solution that can hold both positions. So
I
that's
would agree
sort
with
of
you
my
there.
statement on it. And
Okay.
go ahead, Cody. What do you think? Because this is kind of a new position. I'm sure that you have a lot of thought on it.
I do have a lot of thought. So I was actually just having a discussion with this about one of my Marxist friends actually. Um, so um, so I mean, as far as children go, I mean, I'm passionately pro-life. I think they should always be kept alive. Um, I mean, I can go through this bit by bit. The point that I want to make to the audience though is, we need to have discussions like this that are irradiated from the emotional part that exists, because even though everybody on the right would like for things to go back to wherever they might have been when abortion was completely illegal or not even on the books, abortions were still taking place in unsafe ways. And I'm saying that as just stating a fact. I'm not saying that as anything to discredit my pro-life position. I'm just saying that for the audience's sake, I recognize that that did exist and that abortions have happened since the beginning of time, and I don't think it's right. I'm not saying that as a justification, but going on to what you said, my thoughts were, um, in terms of in terms of different arguments that I've heard, and because I mean I wasn't alive in the '70s, and I know that the original person that wanted to have the abortion, she actually became pro-life at the end of her life. So um, that's a testament to. As far as children go, I think we have to protect our babies. I mean, I can understand from the perspective, if you honestly believed, and this is something that it's taken me a long time to come to this conclusion. Like, I understand now that people who believe in abortion, they don't actually believe that they're killing a living being, because no one is a sick, horrible monster. I mean, maybe there's like four people or five, maybe there's a very, very, very small, minute percentage of people that actually believe they're killing something. But the problem that I've realized is that people on the right that are constantly all about this pro-life stuff, which I am very staunchly pro-life, they constantly go back to, well, you're killing something. Well, these people don't actually believe that they're killing something. And so if we're going to have a discussion about that, the first thing that we have to reconcile as a society is what actually happens during an abortion, so that people understand. Um, so I mean, one of the the big people, and I'm not going to mention any names because it would be polarizing already. People would click off. But one of the people that was big in the movement, she actually got to witness an ultrasound abortion, and she could see the fetus struggling and all this. I mean, and from a biological scientific perspective, um, we actually, if you would consider a single-celled organism a baby, like an amoeba or something, then you could make the argument again for some fetal tissue. I mean, it has a heartbeat at 6 weeks. That was a compromise that um, was being made. But this scar tissue that is developed around this, I mean, if you'd even talk about like African American communities, their populations have been decimated since the 1970s because of abortion.
So
Um,
Cody, I want to jump in here
so
because
okay, I'll jump
I'm
in.
I'm
Okay.
I'm trying to bootstrap a new conversation about
Oh,
abortion
new conversation.
instead
Okay.
of like
Am I
repeating.
hashing hawking points?
Yeah,
Okay. I'm
you're
sorry.
kind of repeating talking points, which I
Oh,
get.
my
I'm sort
bad.
of like no, it's fine. Like
My
that
bad.
like this is the true like sort of automatic reaction that you go through when I um sort of pitched you the position that I want, and so I let
Okay.
talk because I wanted to see what your like sort of natural reaction was, given that you are very much a pro-life person, and it's not like I hold that against you.
Okay.
I'm trying to work on finding a better way of talking about this topic so that we as a society can find a position that that you were like, okay, may not be the position that I want, but it's a position that takes care of what I most care about,
Okay.
instead of us having a conversation where both sides sort of collapse into a level of extremism that ends up with no one anywhere close to satisfied,
Okay.
except for the most crazy and frustrating to interact with people. And so, sort
I
of,
love the way you phrase that. That's funny.
it's like because I like the purple-haired feminists who's screeching, "You just want to control women's bodies," um, is not the kind of person that I want to be satisfied in
Mhm.
this.
Mhm.
But neither do I want the very slimy Christian minister and his wife, who spends his time extorting his church people and manipulating everybody uh, with deeply sacred concepts for his own benefit, to feel like he's won at life because abortion is illegal in his state. Like these are the kinds of people that I do not want to win. And
Okay.
when it comes to the abortion debate, most of the time they're the ones who are ending up with like the strong positions. And I don't think that they actually
Mhm.
have strong positions. What they have are positions that are
Emotional.
so so basic that they're hard to argue about. Not because they're smart or healthy or productive or practical positions, but that they're so simple that
Mhm.
you can't argue with them.
Okay.
And I want to try and avoid that. I want to go deeper on the topic.
Okay.
And so I kind of described what I think is going on, which
Okay.
is in one sense we've got this medical technology, which means that um like a I think that maybe the language even needs to be changed here. A
Okay.
future child, I think,
Mhm.
is the right way to talk about um, a like fetus or fetal tissue or like what happens during the course of a pregnancy. I think
Okay.
future child, conceptualize it because like the left will say fetal tissue
Mhm.
or something to that, and it's like we're talking about something that has like a heartbeat and
Mhm.
potentially brain activity, and then
Mhm.
the right will talk about like a baby or like a person when we're talking about like a clump of cells or something that like has no experience of life, that is sort of entirely reliant upon the mother for its existence. And there, at some point during the pregnancy, there's a transition between these different talking spaces, but we're never going to agree on where that point of transition is, because there's many different points of transitions throughout the development cycle, from like the single matured cell after the point of conception, through to like that cell dividing, meeting the uterine wall, and then starting to take shape, developing its first internal organs, developing its basic shape, as 2 legs, 2 arms, a head, developing a spinal cord, brain, eyes. This is a gradual process, and different steps can take place at like very early on, but the realization of that step might, like in a real sense, might happen much later on. It's very complicated, and trying to nail down scientifically where you can tell from like an ultrasound what stage you're at. It's all a mess, and I don't think that that's necessarily the way we should be talking about this. I think really future child gives us a good concept of what we're really talking about. We're more talking about a potential human soul, and we're not talking about the absence of a human soul as much as the potential of one. Just the same as a child is not a firefighter, but that child might have an inclination to become a firefighter. And so in some sense, you don't want to consider like a child the way that you would consider a firefighter, but you don't want to treat the child as if they have no heroism within them. Does that sort of metaphorically?
I feel like you're
Makes sense
talking
to you?
about two different planes of existence, though, and I'm having trouble grasping what you're trying to say.
Okay. Let's go back to it. So the language that I've offered here of future child, I think gives us, it's like we're out of the space where we're talking about a parasite, which would be like the extreme feminist left version of this. And we're also outside of the realm where you're talking about murder. We're in a realm where we're talking about a future person's life. And we're also talking about what happens to a potential mother throughout the course of her pregnancy, but also the next 18 years of her life until this potential child becomes a potential adult. And we're not using like extremely, emotional isn't the right word, but charged or triggered or landmined. We're not using language that goes through the minefield. We're trying to use a different language format that doesn't enter the minefield.
Well, that's actually one of my goals with people that are pro-choice. I mean, if you want to say pro, and I've tried to figure out how to have different discussions, because, I mean, ultimately we're gonna have to walk back and walk back and walk back until we can get to some kind of meeting ground. I mean, I agree that it is a future child. I mean, in that sense, you could possibly make that argument. The issue that I've always had with whatever argument is a middle ground, and I'm not trying to sound like a self-righteous asshole either, because I know people have their own whatever. Um, I mean, I mean, I wouldn't even say theologically, but when you engage in the procreative act, if you will, I'm using a sexologist term, but when you engage in that particular a la mode, you're literally creating the chance for life to occur. And so I have a hard time with the fact that the state even had to get involved in this in 1970. Like, I have a hard time with the state having to be involved in it now, because, like, if you even want to compare and contrast, like, adoption, okay, like, two people, like, we're just talking about liberty versus statism in the sense, okay, if you two people, two consenting adults, get in a relationship and you procreate, you are within your legal rights as an adult in whatever country you exist in, with the exception of North Korea, to basically, you know, have the child or not have the child, and or whatever, and you raise the child. If you adopt a child, the state gets involved and they have to know everything about you, and they want you to raise the kid, and it has to be within certain parameters. And so what I don't understand, and this is going back to what you were talking about, how we have like this language where it's not minefielded. Like, when you have a law, in the way that the country's worked in the law, I think the country's been like this for a really long time, but I couldn't give you a year. It seems like whenever we have a law that makes a law, we have to have more laws that further codify the law. And so, and I mean, that's one of Joe Biden's positions, is he wants to codify abortion law. And I'm like, okay, well, I mean, more language could always help codify things, but it's like, how far down the rabbit hole do we codify, you know? And so we talk about this, and I don't, I don't know. I mean, honestly, um, I think you're talking about, when you said landmine language too, in the sense of um like a society. What do we want for our kids? We have to protect them. We have to want the best for them. And the thing that disturbs me the most about the whole thing, irregardless of whatever position you're on, is ultimately, we're talking about, like, from an evolutionary perspective, we're talking about a womb, like an organism that exists within a mother's, like, body. And so, I mean, I would hope that our future children could feel safe in their mother's womb. Like, that's the thing that bothers me probably the most. And I mean, I can understand from a financial perspective, and from all the, the shame that may come from that, and certain things. But the thing that bothers me the most, from a purely, like, humanity perspective, is that's a mother's womb. That, a baby panda would be safe in a panda's womb, because there's no way for her to, remove whatever. And so, you have this competition for resource. I think that's the thing that just bothers me the most, is that it had to come to a state getting involved, i.e., the government or the state governments and appellate courts, and we all had to decide what happened to a baby who's supposed to feel safe. And I think that's where the argument hinges with me, and I don't know where you want to go with it, but I think that's the, and I'm not trying to use landmine language. I'm just saying, for me,
Yeah,
that's the part where
I
I'm just like,
follow you. No, you're actually making a really deep point that I respect quite a bit. Although it's hard to bring it into a purely secular rationalist perspective, but I actually deeply, I deeply feel an alignment with what you're putting out, and it's like I really like the way that you're saying it, that we want a world where the mother is a safe place for the child. Like that's what you're saying, that like the womb where the child is inside the mother should be incredibly safe, because on like a deep level that doesn't make sense necessarily in like a purely rational perspective, but makes very, very deep sense in terms of what we are as a species and what we should hold sacred, because it's actually vitally important to maintaining what it is that we are as living beings. That like the sort of like, as you grow up as a child and become older, like you venture further and further away from the mother, and that the closer you are to the mother, and the closest you can be to the mother is inside the womb, the safer existence should be. And like I appreciate that, because that is actually a deep position. And like it's actually kind of an important position in terms of how we as a species, as like minds inside of bodies that experience the world, like the way that we experience the world is going to be radically altered, whether like the closer you are to the mother, the safer you are or not. And like something about that is like incredibly sacred. It's
I
incredibly
feel like
sacred, and
that's
it's
as much
deeply
as I can
important.
codify my position. By the way, like I
Yeah,
feel
no,
like
I
that's
I,
yeah.
I get, like, you know, like I'm putting out like a strong amount of respect for how you've stated, you know, what deeply you feel, because this is what's actually important about getting this conversation right, so that we can find a deeper position which works for us, like as a totality, as a species, across time, as society, as culture. Like what you said, is actually vitally important to working out this conversation. I don't have like a immediate response to that. That's like a counterpoint. Like, you know, I would definitely take the, the pro-choice position here in rebuttal, but I don't have like a specific rebuttal, because I share your sentiment fully, which is why I've been talking about um, the the necessity, like what I was saying, like when I started my riff on abortion, is that we need to hold this like future sacred, and like, children as representatives of the future as sacred. And what you're speaking to is a deep part of what it means to hold those children as sacred. And so, like, there's a strong alignment there. On the other hand, on the other swing of this,
Ooh,
I think that
muscle spasm.
uh,
Sorry.
uh, yeah, it's fine. We're humans going through life, so like stuff like this happens,
Okay.
and I don't worry about it.
Okay.
It's normal, and actually being normal is way better than trying to present like a overly perfect front to the world. Like I don't like that. I'm a big fan of presenting persona to the world, but that's mostly because it's fun. But sort of this overly perfect veneer,
Overly
um,
perfect veneer.
that people put forward, I don't really have patience for. So, the kind of the other end of this is that like love and sex and being with each other is also deeply sacred, and it shouldn't feel like, for women, it shouldn't feel like a power game where all the interactions have this potential of determining your entire life. And so like there is sort of a backswing to some of that perspective. I don't want to go into it too deeply because I haven't considered it too deeply. I haven't, the way that you've phrased this and framed this is not something that I've encountered before. I haven't considered it in exactly that light before. So I don't want to try and overstate, the conversation on this. I I think that what we really need is a culture where the unborn and the newborn and the child and what the child represents as the totality of the future unfolding are held sacred in culture. I don't think that this, like, holding sacred in culture, needs to be enshrined in some kind of punitive law, and that to do it right, actually, there should be a lot more freedom to make decisions about what that future coming into being will be. But this, like, it's the framing that we have where it's like the pregnant woman and the doctor is really not, like, it's just their decision, and like nobody else is involved, and it's very isolated and very isolating. Like this conversation isn't health, like that side of it isn't really healthy either. Like on some level that's a defensive position, like trying to protect abortion. I think if we were clearer with each other that, like, the ability to make good decisions, like make good choices, was something that was respected as part of the whole of holding the future sacred, which doesn't necessarily bringing into being every possible future, but is holding the future sacred and then bringing forward only that which will be the best future. I think that while we don't really have the tools of what that will be yet, what that would look like yet, I think that there's something in that space of discussion that could work for everybody. And I'm trying to find a way to, walk the conversation there. And I don't ask you to endorse my position, but do you see the potential of that, and are you open to sort of exploring that territory more than sort of just holding a hard line, like pro-life in the sense of being anti-abortion instead of being pro-life in the sense of fully realizing a culture of life, which could include abortion?
Well, I don't think. I mean, I don't think that abortion needs to be included. Um, because I think it's the destruction of a being that again should feel safe. But if we're going to have a culture, the culture must be of life. We need to be a society that protects life, and it needs to protect the life of the unborn. It needs to protect the life of the born. It needs to protect the life of the young child. It needs to protect the life of the teenager, of the young adult, of the middle adult, and of the senior citizen, and of the palliative care terminally ill, all the way up until death. We can't just have this, discussion of just the unborn. And and the idea, the other thing that just really destroys me is, the Communist Party of China went and destroyed all the beautiful girls that were being had because they wanted a labor force of men, and so now they're having a, a lady shortage, literally, and so I mean, it's just it's really sad because w- if you could think about it within, and I understand what you're saying completely, because you're like, it's the totality of our race, like we should protect our race, the human race, like it's to me.
I would push back against you slightly that I think the right word here is species,
Well,
and race has
well,
become such a loaded term that
okay.
I would choose to avoid it in any
Okay,
context
species.
really.
Sure, you
But yeah,
because
yeah,
that's Star
us
Trek
as
and species.
humanity as species. I
Yeah,
get what you're saying. I'm just looking out for you, I guess.
yeah. No, that makes sense because then there's this guy. There's people that on the internet that's gonna be like, this guy's a neo, you know. And
Yeah.
I mean our species, like our human species, like if we're ever gonna become a bifurcating species and we're gonna go to Mars or Jupiter or whatever we choose to inhabit, we're gonna need people. Um, and we need to protect our species and prolong our species for as long as possible. I mean, maybe we're the greatest species that ever lived. Maybe we're not. I don't know, but we shouldn't be we shouldn't be deciding which of our own, you know, people gets to make it out. And I mean, it's we haven't reached the level of society in like a Star Trekian society where there's no more competition for resources. Like we haven't ventured among the stars enough for that. But we ultimately need to have a discussion as a species. Like I feel like this is a worldwide issue where and I know that I feel like national borders need to be protected, but us as a species need to have a discussion about our like global society because the internet has made it so that we're global, and I think we'll eventually make decisions as a globe. And I'm not a one world government kind of guy. I'm just saying like I feel like if everybody could retain their own individual culture, like the Italians and the Irish and the Polish and the Africans, and you know, but then still thought collectively as a species, as Earthlings, like the world would be a very different place. I think, um, but I understand that there are certain events in everybody's life that shape them one way or the other, and that each person has a unique cultural perspective. Um, I think the other thing that I land on that's terrible is, um, you know, from the perspective of a paternal thing. You mentioned the doctor. You know, if the mother doesn't have her partner around, so the doctor kind of like plays this as best as he's able to, kind of like caregiver, whatever. Um, you know, where does the father end up if you know he's no longer around and paying child support? And then you have that argument. Um, so um, as a society, I think there has to be, for every reaction there's an opposite reaction. I think if we realize that our events were chained together, you know, like if we're going to do something with somebody else, there's a chain there. And so, and we all have to keep the chain as shiny as possible to, you know, make sure that the world keeps spinning. I mean, it's going to spin anyway because of gravity and magnetic core that's beneath the Earth's surface. But I mean, uh, I think that the issue of this ultimately boils down to um, collectivism, but also the personal responsibility of the parties that are involved. So I was just wanted to say that.
So, mm, one of the things that I wanted to show you, I need to find it.
Okay.
Uh, so I believe Jack London story.
All right.
Uh, you know, he wrote White Fang, Call the Wild.
Mm-hmm.
Um, let's see. And I'm trying to find. I've got a Jack London
Okay.
book here,
Okay.
and one of the stories in this
Mm-hmm.
um, anthology, if my memory serves, and I probably read this when I was like 12, so um, it's And the Forest of the North. I think that was the one I was looking for. In the Forest of the North. Okay, that's probably not it. There's a story of, and this is all from memory, so I may not even have the author right, but I'm pretty sure it was Jack London.
Okay.
There's a story of this native elder from the north, and he's with his tribe, which is his family, like sons, daughters, grandchildren, and he's gotten so old that he cannot really travel with them, and they need to make a big journey in order to survive the coming winter. They need to go to somewhere where there's more food, and the trip is just really more than he can handle. And maybe if they spent all of their energy in supporting him, they could make the journey with him. But that also risks that they get stuck and don't make it out before winter, right? And so what happens is sort of the elder decides that what he's going to do is he's going to stay up north for the winter. This is what he tells his kids: "Is I'm just going to stay here. I'll build myself a camp, give myself a fire, and I'll be able to hunt, and I'll be able to dig up enough food so that I'll be here when you come back." He says something to this effect. I'm not sure if I'm completely accurate, and it may be that he's like, but basically he's decided that it's his year to die. And so, because to live longer is to also, one, suffer because he's got arthritis and stuff, but also to hurt his family. And so he's decided that he can't do that. And so they set him up with a fire, and everybody, like the adults, like his sons and the warriors, they understand what he's doing, and some others perhaps don't. But he stays behind at the camp, and with a fire, and then the family walks away. And as the last page comes to a close, it's like there's a howling of wolves in the distance, and kind of implies that he's not going to last terribly long there by himself. And in some sense, this is like a tragedy because somebody's dying. And in some sense, it's a tragedy because, in some theoretical sense, it's a preventable death. On the other hand, it's a beautiful story of courage, bravery, and wisdom. In the sense that it's courageous to, as we might call it, in the narrative metaphorical frame of warriors and kings falling upon one's sword as a courageous act, and sort of a beauty of like the deep love and bond between family, playing out, and the deep love there, and in terms of wisdom of it is my time and I can accept that without suffering, and go into the great beyond without tearing a rift in the current moment. And so, there's a lot of layers to that story, and I couldn't find it while quickly browsing through the book because the title evades me. But that kind of story is the kind of thing that I personally find enlightening about these kinds of discussions. Instead of being sort of an absolutist position where it's like, even if it risks the entire family freezing to death, they should take care of their elder, or like the elder should force himself upon the family until they are forced to decide to reject him. Instead, it's sort of, now is my time and I can accept this, and we can leave each other with a deep bond of love in our hearts without having to tear ourselves apart in the process. And I find that like far more healthy relationship with life and death than much of what is commonly depicted in what the social justice activists might call white culture or whiteness. And I
I hear
often
that
think,
term a lot.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's far overused and rarely used well, but there is a sense to it where I completely understand what they're talking about. And I think the cultural depiction of this is the family in the mansion murder mystery, where everybody is fighting over the inheritance. And like the sort of the old, almost always man holding on to all the wealth and power until he is murdered, and then the will is disclosed, and there's all drama, and the entire family tears itself apart over like whatever gold is tossed their way. Like every single aspect of that is pathological, and there's no beauty, wisdom, or even tragedy in it. It's all just drama and the monstrosity of the human spirit, or like the demonic side of the human soul on full display. And contrasting these two gives me like a different perspective on what a culture of life looks like. So one of these, it's the story of the mansion in some sense could be the ultimate pinnacle of a quote culture of life where someone clings on to life and power to their last breath. And it's like, this is the pinnacle of life. He lived the longest life that he could have and, maximized that life. But on the other sense, that's a deeply, deeply screwed up culture of death. And it's a cult of death where death is this terrifying thing that must be avoided at all costs, which means all costs, where every single cost is carried forward until death. And then all that cost is let loose upon the world and to ravage in a most terrible way. And in the likewise sense, it could be seen that the story of the elder accepting death is a culture of death. It's like, I will take death when it comes to me and not fight it. In another sense, it's a deep culture of life because it passes on as much good to the next generation as possible, as much life to the next generation without risking their lives for the life of one who is nearly at his end and
Well, that's
can
what
take his
Einstein
end.
did.
Yeah, that's what, and that elder near his end takes his end with dignity, and doesn't fight death, but instead embraces it because he has embraced life in such the same way. And when it comes to talking about this whole thing, and like you described, a culture of life needs to consider the unborn and the born and the child and the teenager and the young adult and the adult and the middle-aged and the elders and those reaching their end and those who are at their end. That culture needs to consider all of these. It doesn't necessarily mean, in my view, sort of given this allegorical story, which I believe was written by Jack London, but which I'm reciting from memory, that doesn't need the name of Jack London attached to it to have meaning, sort of carries forward a different perspective where each part of it should be weighted and considered, but doesn't necessarily need to be maximized to the exclusion of all other considerations. And in that sense, life is the living and the experience of living, not of the being alive itself, if that makes sense. And not to be overly rhetorical and long-winded, but sort of like the point in there that I'm trying to make is, I think the deep point and where much of the paths and the wires get crossed. So if it makes sense to you, I'd like you to respond with some thoughts, and then I think we're probably at the point where we'll wrap up after that.
Yeah, I was gonna say because I'm gonna have to wrap up. Yeah. Um. So I mean, I can understand that in that situation. Because I mean, if a sentient being wants to make a decision to prolong the life of his clan, so to speak, um, that's even written in the in theology, Catholic theology, that if a sentient being of his own free will has a sickness and chooses to, go peacefully into the great beyond, so to speak, he has allowed enough free will to do so. Um, However, where I would draw the line is with like euthanasia. I think that people should aspire to a natural end, because I think that even though some days on this planet can be gloomy and horrible and terrible, there's always this little glint of hope. I mean, um, I, I don't want to go into anything personal, but one of these things that stuck out in my mind. I was watching a news story of a girl that got kidnapped in Syria, and she was held captive by some terrible people, and she was given a rug to basically sleep on while she was being held in this prison. Um, and she had sought to eventually end her own life with like a razor blade, and at that moment, there was a bird that actually flew and landed on her window seal. Um, and she said that that was enough beauty for her to keep going. Um, so I would challenge people to try to find the beauty in that. I mean, um, there are some. I know that some people that have worked in that field of mental health, mental illness, have said that um, they see people of all ages, and it worries them, especially when they see the younger generation, the light kind of go out of their eyes and that kind of thing. Um, I think that there needs to be a great deal paid to mental health, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about capitalism. Is I think we need to focus on education, and focus on education that empowers people so that they can, with the dollar and the dream that America was founded upon, occur whatever, whatever they would like to occur. Um, I think that pretty much is a summation of things that I want to cover. And like I said, I agree with your original point that if a sentient human being chooses to, of his own will, live out the rest of his days in peace to preserve his family, I think that that's a worthy um, admonishment. So.
Okay. Well, um, I I think that kind of the idea of building a different conversation
Mhm.
um, is a bit tricky,
Mhm.
because it mostly as as my friend, we're sort of, we hang out and we talk, and
Mhm.
um, I'm sort of not holding this conversation against you in any sense, but
Mhm.
mostly I've sort of been trying to elaborate novel position, and
Mhm.
mostly you've met me with sort of traditional talking points.
Yeah, the
I would say,
conservative in me. My bad.
yeah, and I suspect that the real thing that needs to happen is that you need time to think about this and percolate it on it, and that maybe like the real move is to have another conversation like 2 weeks or 3 weeks from now after you
Mhm.
thought about it, because I'm throwing a bunch of really new stuff at you, and I don't expect you to be able to think through everything of what I'm saying in the moment. So it's totally fine, and like I can see you in some sense thinking about some of what I'm saying, but not really being able to respond with anything that is sort of what you have thought through, because it's just an hour or 2 hours is not enough time to consider something that is so different. Like I've spent months to years thinking through what I've sort of pitched to you as the
Mhm.
alternative to the current argument,
Mhm.
and so I give you sort of the full credit of, let's come back to this conversation again another time
Okay.
and see, like, give you the time to think about it so that you
Mhm.
can come to me with thoughts that are response to what I've said, instead of um, repeating what you know how to say.
Yeah, I mean you're not wrong about that. Um, I mean the only thing that I can tell you, um, is the only thing that would be different. I mean that would be mostly um myself speaking, is if I were to speak about this from a physics perspective, like a molecular perspective, from a standpoint of digital physics. Like a digital physics is the study of seeing the universe as a computer, and so we're all like individual micro dots on a screen, or we're individual transistors on a chip, or we're um, data going across a node. Um, I think that we all have to consider our collective ideology as a species, um, and we have to protect and preserve that species and everyone in it, from birth until natural expiration, if you will. Uh, I'm not. I think that um, the one thing that I will say about the state of society, I think we've lost touch with our primal instincts. I think we've lost touch with being outside, being among the animals and the plants and the birds and the sea and the fish and the squirrels. And I think we've lost. Um, we're, we we've been an agrarian society for millions of years, and it's only been in the last um, 200 or 300 years that we've become an industrial society, but especially in the last 100, um,
Yep.
we've transitioned. And I feel like people have lost touch with the circle of life that takes place within a natural evolutionary species of birth to death. And I mean, I think that's as pretty real as what I can give you in terms of like what I actually think about, because I think that we all come from obviously an omnipotent being, but I think that we're created from the stuff of the universe, and that we eventually go back to the omnipotent being, but the one who created all things is, not just gonna blink. I think that we're all very incredibly special, brilliant, beings and that we all have the potential to change the world. But I think we have to think about ourselves and our place in the universe differently if we're going to get to the next phase of our development and our evolution as a species. So,
Well, I think that there's a lot in there that is fair.
yeah,
Um, I
thanks.
I would like to maybe delve into some more of the broader philosophy of sort of the what is the meaning of life stuff and the rest of that on a future discussion, and maybe
Sure.
we can weave like these two topics because I think abortion by many of the people that I see as intellectuals is seen as like a side issue
Mm-hmm.
topic that is sort of like both sides are crazy, and so it's like we need some kind of resolution. But like this is personally to me one of the deepest and most important conversations
Mm-hmm.
that we can have, because I think it gets to so much of the bedrock
Mm-hmm.
of what divides us, and
Mm-hmm.
finding a multidimensional perspective where that bedrock settles
Mm-hmm.
into something that is uh, satisfactory for all of us, that really solves the problems that we on all sides of the political and social and cultural rift can find agreement on is actually vitally important. And this is one of the topics that I think has the clearest and strongest potential for a real resolution if
Mm-hmm.
we start to think about it deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we may need to bring in some of what is the meaning of life in order to solve this issue. And I think we need to go as deep as we can go in the elements of conversation and philosophy that are necessary to resolve this particular topic. But
Mm-hmm.
um, like I'm strongly planted in that. I believe that a resolution is satisfactory to all, like not to the extreme crazies,
Mm-hmm.
as you might say, but like something that you and say my sister could find a place to handshake on,
Mm-hmm.
where you might not come to that handshake immediately, even
Mm-hmm.
after it's laid out, because it's sort of a balancing act to actually meet it. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like in some sense it may be that high wire um, thing where walking to the center you have to place each foot very very carefully to actually meet for the handshake.
Mm-hmm.
So it is not something where I or somebody else can simply say, this is the solution, now shake hands on it. It's actually
Mm-hmm.
something that we need to take a step, and it's like, will you take the step that meets my step? And then the
Mm-hmm.
other person takes that step. And it's like, we can both see the goal, but we can't just jump to the goal. We have
Mm-hmm.
to step by step work our way there. Even if we can
Mm-hmm.
see the goal with full clarity, we cannot just agree on it. We have to walk towards it together and
Mm-hmm.
watch each other walk towards it in order
Mm-hmm.
to actually resolve it. And I think that's some of these positions,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the frustration that people have on a lot of politics is that we're not doing that walk. We're expecting everybody to jump from one position to a completely new position. And I don't
Right.
expect that of people. I expect people
Mm-hmm.
to take, like I've gone through a couple of leaps in my life,
Mm-hmm.
and mostly it's small steps, and I'm more interested in having small step conversations that point
Me
to
too.
great leaps than to expect only great leaps. Like I want to have like I'm looking for great leaps, but I am expecting small steps. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to hold conversations where the small steps lead to the location that you can leap to,
Mm-hmm.
instead of expecting you to jump over a lake to an island. I
Great
want to
way to
show
put that, man.
you. I want to show you those rocks in the water that you can step on.
Gotcha.
And so I've started with like, this is the island that I think that we can meet on, that everyone can meet on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think next conversation that we have on this, which can be far more broad ranging than just the topic we've covered, but I think we'll come back to that topic with greater depth. We'll start exploring some of those stones on the path.
All right, sounds good.
All right. Cody, thanks for talking with me.
Thanks for talking with me.
And this is a great conversation. I enjoyed it. I think that you've said some things that I found quite deep and respectful, and other things that were, to me, clearly just bringing up the talking points that you had available, because those were the words that you had available. But after maybe percolating on this and thinking about it, we'll have some new words and some new conversation to bring to it next time around. So I'm very hopeful and excited about our next conversation, and I'll see you around,
too.
Cody.
See you around.
Have a good one.
You too.
Good night, man.
Good night.